Okay, let's have a look at risk assessment. Now, a couple of definitions you'll have to remember for the exam, because questions on risk assessment come up quite often. The first one is hazard. A hazard is anything with the potential to cause harm. So when you're carrying out risk assessments, anything basically could be a hazard. It's the risk that causes concern. In other words, the risk is likelihood of hazards causing actual harm. So that's another definition to remember. And the last definition is control measures. These are items or actions to remove the hazard or reduce the risk. Now, it's worth remembering how to carry out a risk assessment. Although this is not a risk assessment course, you will need to know the steps involved in carrying out a risk assessment. They are undertaken in a specific order. Let's have a look at the first thing. The first thing is to identify all hazards, and secondly to identify who is at risk. The next thing, you need to evaluate the risks, where we consider the severity of hazard and likelihood of harm. Now, I will show you examples of this just to explain how we evaluate risks. This is where we give it a value. Now, it could be high, medium or low, or actually give it a numerical value. We implement further control measures. We record the assessment, it's dated, recorded, is signed, and we review when necessary. Certainly every year, but it could be sooner. If, say for example, you carry out a risk assessment in a particular area and an accident happens within the next 2 or 3 months in that area, then a risk assessment would have to be carried out then rather than wait the year for the annual risk assessment. Now, there are two types of risk assessment. The first one is an informal risk assessment. This is the sort of thing we do every day. We wake up in the morning, perhaps we're going to work, we're crossing the street to go to the office or to where we work, and there's a bus coming down the road. Then we decide then, can we get across the street before the bus comes and knocks us down? So we're carrying out really a risk assessment. But it's informal, we don't write it down, we don't document it, we don't record it. The other risk assessment is the formal risk assessment. Now, this is based on the mandatory requirement for employers to make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risk to the health and safety of their employees whilst at work, and it must be recorded and dated and filed away. And this is the one that's changed, or it's reviewed every year. Now, a formal risk assessment must only be carried out by somebody who's been trained in risk assessing. There's actually a course on risk assessment, and somebody who's got the knowledge, experience and skills to undertake such assessments. Now, just to give an idea of the difference between hazard and risk, so we looked at hazard, anything with the potential to cause harm, and risk is the likelihood that harm will occur from that particular hazard. So imagine a Native American with 3 sharp knives, perhaps stood in a corner of a room, and as long as nobody interacts with that person, he's just a hazard. He's got the potential to cause harm. But now, what if we introduce an element of risk? In other words, we're asking that Native American to throw the sharp knives at the young lady. There's the risk. Is it high, is it medium or low? Here's another example. We've got a great white shark swimming in the sea by himself. He's a hazard. He's got the potential to cause harm, but as long as there's no interaction between him and anybody else, there will be no risk. But what if somebody swims near the shark? There's a high risk. Or somebody actually goes fishing for the shark, which is a medium risk. Unless you've seen Jaws 1, where that was quite a high risk, where one of the actors actually fell into the Jaws mouth, and so yeah, that was a very high risk. But anyway, usually we'd class as a medium risk. Low risk, watching a shark in an aquarium, and no risk, watching a shark on a DVD or a video. Again, unless you've seen Jaws 1, where that head rolls out of the boat, I tell you that could be a very extremely high risk. Okay, now, risk assessments are covered under the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regs 1999. Now, you don't need to remember that regulation, just to remember that risk assessment is a mandatory requirement under that regulation. And it states that every employer shall make an assessment of the risks to employees and others. It's a systematic assessment of the business and how it affects others, the work activities, condition of their premises, and the assessment must be reviewed when no longer valid or if there's been significant change. Again, the assessment must be reviewed. It's usually every year. Now, even though a risk assessment is mandatory under the Health and Safety at Work Regs, Management of Health and Safety at Work Regs 1999, it does have its own benefits, besides it being a legal requirement. For example, there's a thorough assessment of all significant hazards. It prioritises the action on the basis of the greatest risk. It gives confidence in health and safety measures. And yes, it does comply with the legal requirement, but as you see before, it does have its benefits. Now, I've mentioned already, we could give the evaluation, the score of the risk assessment, a high, medium or low score. But most companies tend to give it a numerical value, and this is where we use a formula, severity times likelihood. Now, this slide is showing you a 5-point system, where severity, we always look at the higher the number, the worst case the scenario. In other words, the worst case scenario of any accident is always death. So number 5 is death, number 4 major injury, 3 minor injury, over 3-day injury, and number 1 is always no injury. Now, I have worked and trained in several factories and companies where they work on even higher point scoring systems. In other words, one company worked on a 10-point system where their number 10 was multiple deaths, number 9 was single death. So it depends on the type of company and business that you actually work for as to the type of scoring system. Now, the next part of the equation is the likelihood. What's the likelihood of the event, of the potential accident happening? Is it number 5, or is the worst case scenario, which is imminent or most likely? Is it number 4, very likely? Is it 3, likely? Is it 2, possible? Or is it 1, unlikely? Okay, let's take you on a scenario journey, if you like. Okay, let's take you on a scenario. Let's just imagine you've got a kitchen. There's a kitchen at work. And within the kitchen you've got a kettle. The kettle's on a draining board with some dripping taps that you can't turn off, so there's a bit of splashing of water near the kettle. The kettle is plugged into an electrical socket. The plug from the kettle has got some bare copper wires coming from it, and the socket is turned on. So let's carry out a risk assessment. What would you think would be the severity of an accident involving that kettle? This is a sort of a simplistic scenario I always ask delegates in my training courses. And you might think, well, what's the worst possible result of an accident with a kettle? Could well be death through electrocution, or possibly major injury. So if that's your score with that particular scenario, that'd give you an initial score of, say, 5 or even 4. Now we need to multiply that by the likelihood. Now the likelihood is, how likely is that accident going to occur with that kettle? Is it imminent, very likely, or likely? And again, people tend to go for either imminent or very likely, because somebody sooner or later is going to stretch over to unplug the kettle, perhaps touch the bare copper wire, and then have the accident. So that gives us an initial score. Say we go for severity major injury. 4 multiplied by 4, which is very likely. 4 times 4 is 16. Now with a 5-point system, anything between 25 and 15 is classed as high. Anything between 15 and 8 is classed as medium. Anything between 8 and 0 is classed as low. Now from that figure there, 4 times 4 is 16. Or even if we had 5 times 4 or 4 times 5 would give us 20, or even 5 times 5 would give us 25. With either of those scores, with that kettle, that gives us a high score. And with all risk assessments, you must undertake measures with the high scoring risk assessments before the medium scoring risk assessments, and certainly before the low scoring risk assessments. So what we need to do is introduce control measures. Now, there is no book of control measures. There's no book that's been published that'll give you all the control measures in the world for every scenario that you can think of. It's all down to practical common sense. So you've got to look at the scenario through your own eyes and decide, well, what would I do? What logically would I do to ensure that this, or I make this a safer working environment? Now let's have a look at the kettle. What can you do? Have a think for a couple of minutes. Well, you might think of removing the kettle, unplugging the kettle, turning the power supply off, throwing the kettle away. You might want to fix the dripping taps, perhaps get a plumber in. You might want to take the kettle away from the kitchen altogether, put it somewhere else. What about plumbing the kettle in, or getting something safer that hasn't got any electrical wire in? Now, by introducing any of those measures, they are what we call control measures. And control measures are introduced to make the workplace, a procedure or a piece of equipment, safer to work with. And that's all a risk assessment is, and all it's meant to do, is to make a safer working environment. So those control measures, they do come in a particular hierarchy. It's what we call the hierarchy of control measures. And they are in this order: elimination, substitution, isolation, enclosure, perhaps local ventilation, then general ventilation if we are carrying out a risk assessment where there's perhaps a smoky or a fume or a vapour filled atmosphere. Good housekeeping, exposure time reduced, training, personal protective equipment, and lastly welfare facilities. Or you could have the personal protective equipment last. Now, personal protective equipment, we'll look at that in the next section. This is the last line of defence. It's the last thing we must consider, sometimes what we call the essential last resort. Whenever you're carrying out a risk assessment and you're introducing control measures, that's the last thing you need to consider. You must go through all the various steps first. And for the sake of the examination, questions have been asked in the past about the first two elements of the hierarchy of control. So it might be worth remembering the first two. The number one is always elimination. Number two is always substitution. So it might be worth jotting those two and remembering those. Now, say for example, if we go back to the scenario of the kettle, what's the first thing we should do with that kettle? But if you look at the hierarchy of control, it's elimination. Get rid of the kettle. Okay, well that's not possible. What if members of staff want a cup of tea or coffee and we can't really eliminate it for good, so what can we do? We'll go to the next section, the next number, which is substitution. Can we substitute the kettle that's there for a safer kettle? Perhaps a kettle that hasn't any wiring, perhaps it's built into the system. And then we go down through the various stages. Can we isolate the kettle? Can we enclose the kettle? And that's what we call the hierarchy of control measures. Now sometimes we need to carry out specialised risk assessments. And this is undertaken under three conditions. Firstly, if we are employing young people between the ages of 16 and 17, certainly under 18 and over 15, or where we employ pregnant women, or working in noisy workplaces. So under these three conditions, we must carry out specialised risk assessments. Okay, what I'd like you to do now is to look at this slide. You've obviously looked at one slide already within a transport related area. Now this is in a department store. So what I'd like you to do now is to pause the presentation and jot down as many areas, as many observations you can make of certain things that are happening or not happening in this slide that's got the potential to cause an accident. In other words, spot the hazards. What's got the potential? So pause the presentation about now and then restart when you're ready. Okay, what did you do altogether? What did you write down? Let's have a look. If we start on the first story, we've got a person here working in some steam or some fumes. Obviously that's a hazard, inhalation of different particles perhaps, and possibly can't see during his work there. We've got a lady here, poor manual handling. Look where she's carrying the tray of cups and the kettle. And we go over here where the for sale sign, or the sale sign rather, not the for sale sign, is too low down. This person could quite easily walk into it. Now if we move over here, this person, a couple of delegates there said to me, is it a youngster or is it somebody who's drunk? I'm not quite sure. But, you know, it's a person who might well fall over onto somebody below. And let's go downstairs. What have we got downstairs? We've got a fire exit that's locked and it's blocked. So if people wanted to get out in case of emergency, they would have no chance. We've got a basket overhanging with the potential to fall onto somebody. We've got some liquid on the floor, potential slipping hazard. We've got a fire holding, or a fire extinguisher holder that's empty. So obviously we don't know where the fire extinguisher has gone. Then we've got the young lady on a till. Now look at the way she's sat. Again, we look at this in the later section and it comes under ergonomics. This can give rise to work-related upper limb disorder. There's no back to the chair, she's too high. So again, I'll mention this in a later section. There's also some trailing cables, if you look down there. Obviously they're a potential tripping hazard. Now, if we go to this lady here, she's not paying any particular attention to anything and her baby's escaped, with the potential to cause harm to himself or herself. That's pink, so I should imagine it's a young girl walking or crawling towards this cupboard which contains chemicals. You can see they're all fallen over and started to spill. Obviously this door should be locked, and this main door that should be blocked off to access to the public anyway. I still don't know what this young child is doing, but again he's got the potential to cause an accident, perhaps by frightening somebody or somebody tripping into him or him actually having an accident themselves. Now we've got a ladder that's being supported or balanced on a block of wood or a book. The ladder itself is not being supported by anybody else, and this person is stretching up, so obviously you have the potential to fall off there anyway. We've got this person here that's, from a manual handling point of view, is not carrying out this performance as best as he could. You must bend your legs at the knees and not swivel at the waist, because you can be putting a lot of pressure on your back by not bending your knees. When we look at that at manual handling later on, because you will get something across your back called the lever force, which means that whatever you're trying to lift up, let's say this is 10 kilograms, there'll be 10 times the amount of pressure across your spine. So you're talking about 100 kilograms of pressure or stress across your leg against your spine. Okay, I think that's about it, but if you didn't notice anything else, there's one thing I almost forgot, and there's this electrical system. Obviously you've got some electrical wiring there, so that needs to be repaired without delay. So, how did you do?